In the bone-chilling cold, a former soldier sat huddled on the sidewalk. A man who had once fought for his country. Now abandoned by society. Forgotten as if he had never existed. Hundreds of people rushed past. Not a single one stopping. But Big Shaq did. What he did next would leave everyone in awe. Where are you watching this video from? Comment below if you believe that a small act of kindness can change someone's fate. Do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to spread this message. No one deserves to be left behind. Winter in New York carries a beauty that is both harsh and unforgiving. The long streets are shrouded in mist. The hurried breaths of passers-by blending into the freezing air. Street lights cast reflections onto the damp sidewalks, painting a picture of a city that is both magnificent and lonely. The bustling crowd moves past one another, each person lost in their own world, oblivious to the struggles happening on the fringes of society. Inside a sleek black SUV, Shaquille O'Neal sat comfortably in the back seat, his deep-set eyes staring thoughtfully through the tinted window. With his towering height and massive frame, he exuded a presence that was both powerful and composed even in silence. He was on his way to an important meeting, but his mind was elsewhere. Shaq was a man of few words when lost in thought. But when he acted, nothing could stand in his way. Suddenly, something on the sidewalk made him pause. He narrowed his eyes, peering through the glass. Amid the hurried crowd, among the expensive suits and designer scarves, there was someone who stood out. An old man curled up on the pavement, wrapped tightly in a tattered, threadbare blanket that had long lost its ability to provide warmth. His faded military coat was wrinkled and covered in patches of wear and tear. His frail, pale hands clasped together, trying desperately to fend off the biting cold. Beside him, a piece of cardboard rested neatly, with shaky but pleading words written across it. "I am a veteran, please help me." Shaq took a deep breath. A veteran. A man who had once fought for this country, and now he was here abandoned. Left to struggle against the merciless winter. A wave of sorrow surged through Shaq, like a rising tide. He did not need to think twice. A decision was made in an instant. Stop the car. His deep, steady voice broke the silence inside the SUV. The driver hesitated for a second, glancing at the rearview mirror to confirm what he had just heard. "Sir, I said stop the car." Shaq repeated, this time with firm resolve. The black SUV slowly pulled over to the curb. The security team accompanying Shaq exchanged puzzled glances. None of them had expected this. An important meeting was waiting. Shaquille O'Neal's time was valuable. But one thing they knew for sure: when Shaq made up his mind, there was no stopping him. The door swung open. Shaq stepped out, unfazed by the icy wind whipping against his face like sharp blades. People on the street started turning their heads. A man standing 7 feet 1 inch, built like a giant, had suddenly stopped in the middle of the busy sidewalk, walking toward a homeless man. No one knew what was about to happen. But one thing was certain: this was not going to be an ordinary encounter. Shaq stepped out of the car, his sturdy footsteps pressing firmly against the cold sidewalk, where gray bricks worn down by time, and the footsteps of thousands lay beneath him. The biting winter wind of New York lashed against his chiseled face, but he did not flinch. Amidst the bustling crowd, the elegant business suits, and the expensive scarves, he was the only one who stopped. Passers-by began to turn their heads, at first unconsciously, but soon whispers started spreading. A few people paused, their eyes widening in disbelief. as they watched the towering figure, a giant of a man, stride purposefully toward a frail, shivering figure curled up on the sidewalk. Shaquille O'Neal, a basketball legend, a millionaire, a global sports icon. What was he doing standing in the freezing cold, facing a homeless man? Shaq's strides were firm, unwavering, his movements devoid of hesitation. When he was just a step away from the man, he stopped the man on the sidewalk. John Miller slowly lifted his head, his eyes sunken and clouded with exhaustion and hunger, carried not just fatigue, but the hollow gaze of someone who had long lost faith in the world. For a brief moment even, he seemed unsure if what he was seeing was real. A blink, a shallow breath. Then suspicion crept into his wary gaze. "Who are you?" John whispered, his voice raspy from the cold, from exhaustion, from the sheer absence of human connection. For far too long, Shaq did not answer right away. Instead, he knelt down, placing one knee on the sidewalk, so that his eyes were level with John's. There was no hesitation, no trace of distance or discomfort. His gaze was steady, deep, and filled with a sincerity that was rare in a world full of indifferent stares. "My name is Shaquille O'Neal. But that does not matter. What matters is, are you okay?" John instinctively flinched, as if unfamiliar with such an unexpected display of concern. Shock flickered across his gaunt, pale face. No one had asked him that in years. No one had truly wanted to know if he was okay. He had grown accustomed to scornful glances, to empty eyes that passed over him, as though he were just another forgotten part of the city's pavement. He was used to sneers, to cold voices telling him to get lost, to security guards shoving him away from storefronts on freezing nights. He had grown used to being invisible. But now kneeling before him was a man the whole world recognized. Looking at him, talking to him, caring about him. There was no pity in Shaq's eyes, no forced generosity, just a simple question. And yet it awakened something long dead inside John. Hope. His lips trembled, struggling to form words. A gust of wind swept through the street, rustling dried leaves and swirling them between the two men, as if trying to erase the invisible boundary between them. One a man at the peak of fortune, the other drowning in the depths of despair. And then John finally spoke. "Why do you care?" His voice was hoarse, shaking, as if he himself could hardly believe he was asking. Shaq smiled, slightly warm yet firm, carrying an unshakable resolve. "Because I do not want to live in a world where someone like you is left behind." Shaq remained kneeling on the cold pavement, his unwavering gaze never leaving John's wary face. The city's noise carried on, cars honking, people rushing past. But in this moment nothing else mattered, except the conversation unfolding between two men from vastly different worlds. John clutched the tattered blanket wrapped around his frail frame, his calloused fingers gripping the worn fabric, as if it were the only thing tethering him to the present. His whole body trembled, not just from the biting chill of a New York winter, but from something deeper, an invisible shudder, drawn from memories that refused to fade. He took a deep breath, struggling to steady the tremor in his voice. But when he spoke, his words were heavy, dropping like stones into the space between him and Shaq. "I used to be a soldier." A silence settled between them, thick and unyielding, as if those words alone had transported him back to another reality, one he could never truly escape. "Afghanistan," John repeated, his voice hoarse. His eyes grew distant, as though he were staring straight through Shaq. beyond the New York streets, beyond time itself, back to the brutal years that had shaped him. Those years are still in my head. I lost so much, and in the end, I lost myself. Shaq said nothing, he only listened. But his eyes said it all: patience, understanding, and above all, respect for the story of a man who had endured the worst life could throw at him. John swallowed hard, as if the words he was about to speak were jagged shards of his past, each one slicing deeper into wounds that had never truly healed. I enlisted when I was 22. I remember the first time I put on the uniform. I remember the first time I held a rifle. I remember stepping onto that plane, watching my hometown shrink behind me, not knowing if I'd ever set foot on that ground again. The memories crashed over him one by one, like an old film reel playing in reverse. We fought relentlessly. A shiver ran through him, his gaze darkening as he continued. I faced death. I watched my brothers get killed right in front of me. I saw my best friends fall in the smoke and sand, heard their final screams as their blood soaked the ground. John's voice dropped lower, as if burdened by the weight of his own words. I remember the first time I killed someone. I did not know his face, his name. I knew nothing except that it was either him or me. And when the bullet tore through him, I realized I had crossed into a world where no one comes back. The same Shaq remained still, but he could feel the storm raging inside the man before him. John swallowed again, his voice breaking, as he reached the moment that had altered his life forever. An explosion. He hesitated, as if even uttering the words would make the memory too real. But then he went on, his voice strangled by what he had lived through. We were on patrol, me and 3 others. We thought the road was clear, that we checked everything, but we were wrong. A bitter, almost hollow smile flickered on John's lips. The kind of smile only a man who had learned the cruelty of fate could wear. I remember hearing a click. John's hands clenched tighter, and then in a single second, everything blew apart. Shrapnel fire, the unbearable heat distorting the air around him, screams, engine roars, chaos, and then silence. A silence more deafening than any explosion. I woke up in a hospital. They told me I was lucky. A hollow, humorless laugh escaped him. The other 3 were not. Shaq felt his chest tighten. I cannot forget them, John said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Lost in the fridge at night, I close my eyes and I still see their faces. I still hear their laughter from the night before, and then in an instant it was gone. John's fists clenched harder, his knuckles turning white. I came back, but I was not me anymore. Everything had changed. For the first time in their conversation, John met Shaq's eyes fully, and for the first time his gaze was not just distant. It was raw, wounded, and lost. I did not die on the battlefield, but a part of me was buried there forever. Shaq swallowed down his own emotions, offering nothing but a solemn nod. He did not speak right away, because he understood sometimes silence was the greatest form of respect. But one thing was certain. This man had suffered enough. John remained silent for a long time. After recounting his years on the battlefield, his breathing was heavy. His eyes still lost in the darkness of his memories. Then slowly, as if a wound that had never fully healed was being torn open again, he lowered his head, his voice breaking, fractured between breaths. They call me a hero. John let out a bitter, twisted smile, as if he himself no longer believed in those words. But they abandoned me when I needed them the most. Shaq remained kneeling beside him, saying nothing, simply watching the shifting emotions in John's eyes. A storm of anger, pain, and despair that only those who had been forsaken could truly understand. My family turned away from me. John clenched the tattered blanket wrapped around him, as if it were the only thing he had left in this world. When I came back, I was not the son they once knew. I did not laugh like before, did not care about their small talk at the dinner table. Loud noises startled me. I could not sleep at night. I saw things they could not understand. I was not part of them anymore. He took a shaky breath, but it seemed to get stuck halfway. And then, my friends, he let out a hollow, empty chuckle. They said I needed time to adjust. But who was going to give me that time? They avoided me, did not know what to say, did not know what to do. They were afraid of me. John's voice grew quieter, as if the strength inside him was slowly draining away. And then they disappeared. Shaq clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white. A wave of anger surged through him. Silent but powerful, a man who had sacrificed, who had given his youth to protect this country, to protect these very people, only to be discarded like something no longer of use. The downward spiral. Lost my home, lost my job. Went into debt. John listed these losses as if they were mere facts, as if he had grown so accustomed to them that they no longer shocked or hurt him. No one wants to hire someone like me. I cannot focus for too long. I get startled easily. Sometimes I get angry and do not even know why. And little by little, no place wanted to take me in anymore. Shaq heard those words, and he understood the world could create a soldier, but it had no plan for bringing him back as a civilian. Once you've stepped onto the battlefield, there's no way back. John continued, his voice carrying the cold emptiness of the dark alleys he now called home, wandering the streets, surviving off spare change. People would toss him a few coins in passing, never looking him in the eye. Some were kinder, leaving a sandwich or a hot cup of coffee, but there were also those who looked at him with disgust, as if his mere existence was something filthy that needed to be erased. I've slept under bridges and train stations and dark alleys. I've been chased away by cops more times than I can count, as if I was not human, just some piece of trash the wind had blown in. I've been beaten by drunk strangers, just for their own amusement. I've been stepped on literally, and not a single person stopped to ask if I was okay. Shaq felt each of John's words cutting into him like razor-sharp blades, cold, hungry, and completely invisible to society. Shaq clenched his hands tighter, his face tense with restrained fury. He could not accept this injustice. A man who had once been willing to sacrifice everything for his country, only to be abandoned so mercilessly by that very country. He looked at John, a man who had reached the very depths of despair, yet was still here, still alive. Even though life had taken everything from him, this could not go on. Shaq's voice was deep, steady, but filled with unwavering determination. John looked up at him, his eyes still clouded, unable to believe that someone truly cared about him again. But this time, Shaq was not just speaking empty words. He was about to take action. And when Shaquille O'Neal decided to do something, nothing could stop him. Shaq remained kneeling beside John, his large hand resting on his knee, eyes locked onto the face of the man in front of him. But John was different. His gaze drifted into the void, lost in a place where cold, painful memories dragged him back. He no longer saw Shaq, no longer heard the bustling traffic around them. All he saw was last winter. He shivered, his voice trembling, as if the cold from that day still clung to his skin, still seeped into his cells, still settled deep into every breath he took. Last winter, the man sleeping next to me died from the cold. Shaq frowned. He said nothing, only tightened his grip slightly. But even that was enough to keep John going. We slept together under that bridge near the bus stop. That night was colder than most, but we were used to the cold. He wrapped himself tightly in his blanket, and I did the same. We did not talk much, just slept, hoping that when we woke up we'd still be alive. John paused, as if the words ahead were too heavy to speak. But the next morning I tried to wake him, and he did not move. Shaq could hear John's breathing grow heavier, his chest rising and falling with difficulty, as if he were battling an invisible panic. I shook him harder. I called his name. But when my hand touched him, John swallowed, his eyes suddenly turning hollow, empty. He was stiff. Shaq clenched his fists. He could not imagine that feeling, the sensation of touching someone who had once laughed, once spoken, once breathed, only to realize that it was all over. No goodbyes, no second chances. Who was he? Shaq asked, his voice deep, warm, but firm. John looked down, the corners of his lips curving into a sorrowful smile. But his eyes could not hide the pain rising within him. He was a Vietnam War veteran. Shaq felt his whole body tense with anger. A veteran, a man who had fought for this country. And yet he had died in the winter, alone and forgotten, as if he had never existed. John did not notice Shaq's reaction. He kept going, as if this story had been locked inside him for too long, and now that it was pouring out, he could not stop. I sat next to him for hours, not knowing what to do. I called the police. They came, they checked. They confirmed he was dead. And then they took him away, like he was just another piece of trash on the street that needed to be cleaned up. Shaq gritted his teeth, rage filling him. And the worst part? John looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. No one cared. No one stopped to ask who he was. No family, no loved ones. No one came to claim his body. He disappeared from this world quietly, as if he had never been here. John took a shaky breath, his voice barely above a whisper. And what scares me the most is one day I'll die the same way. He lowered his head, his trembling fingers clutching the thin blanket wrapped around him. One day I'll just be another body on the sidewalk. Someone will find me, call the cops, and they'll take me away. No one will cry for me, no one will remember me. I'll be forgotten. Shaq took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. But inside his fury was a storm rising uncontrollably. Fury at the system, fury at society. Fury at the indifference of this world. And, more than anything, he could not let that happen. He did not care about the people passing by. He did not care about the curious stares, or the silent questions in their heads. Because right now, only one thing mattered. Shaq reached out, taking John's hand, wrapping it tightly in his own. No, John flinched, looking up at Shaq, startled by the certainty in his voice. That will not happen, Shaq repeated every word. A vow. I will not let you die here. John blinked, as if he could not believe what he was hearing. No one had ever told him that before. No one had ever promised he would not be forgotten, but Shaquille O'Neal was not a man who made empty promises. And from this moment on, everything would change. Shaq's hand remained firmly wrapped around John's, radiating a warmth that the man likely had not felt in years. In the middle of a bitter winter, amidst streets crowded with indifferent souls, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, John felt something different. A kind of care that was not born from pity, but from pure unshakable sincerity. John looked up at Shaq, his eyes filled with doubt. He had heard empty promises before. People had tossed him a few spare coins, handed him a piece of bread, or sometimes even offered a nod of sympathy. But no one ever stayed. No one ever truly wanted to change anything. He blinked, his voice hoarse, hesitant as if afraid that speaking the words out loud would cause everything to vanish in an instant. "Are you serious? You're really gonna help me?" Shaq did not answer right away. He held John's gaze, making sure the man in front of him understood that this was not just another meaningless gesture. Then, with unwavering certainty, he nodded, his deep voice carrying a quiet but undeniable power. 100% trust me." John remained silent, trusting someone. That was a luxury he could not afford. He had been betrayed too many times, abandoned, forgotten. His faith in people had run dry long ago. He wanted to believe Shaq God. He wanted to, but deep inside, a cold, cruel voice whispered, "No one stays, they always leave. They always do." John lowered his head, his shoulders trembling. Not from the cold this time. Shaq did not let go. He could feel the war waging inside John. He had met countless people in his life, the strong, the powerful, the wealthy, but no one had made him feel quite like this. John was a fighter, but the world had beaten him down so relentlessly that he had forgotten how to stand tall. Shaq exhaled softly. He understood. And he knew that for someone like John to trust again, words were not enough. Without hesitation, he pulled his phone from his coat pocket. He dialed a number, brought the phone to his ear, and spoke, with a quiet authority that left no room for doubt. "I need a hotel room right now. A warm, clean room with a bed and hot water. And I need a doctor to check him out." John's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. He could not trust his own ears. But Shaq was not finished. He turned to his security detail, his tone firm. "Get him a proper meal. No fast food, a hot meal. Something fit for a human being." John stared at him, his expression caught between desperation and fragile hope. He had been hungry for so long that he had forgotten what a real meal felt like. He had survived on crumbs, on watery soup from charity kitchens, on scraps left behind by strangers. And now someone was ordering a meal for him. Someone was getting him a warm bed. Someone actually cared. John clenched his hands into fists, trying to say something, but his throat tightened. No one had ever done this for him. No one had ever looked at him like he was worth something. Shaq placed a gentle but steady hand on his shoulder, his voice deeper now, filled with an unshakable resolve. "You fought for this country. Now it's time for this country to fight for you." John looked at Shaq, and for the first time in years, there was the faintest glimmer of light in his eyes. A spark he thought had been lost forever. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe. John was still in shock, his eyes struggling to believe what was unfolding before him. He had grown accustomed to being forgotten, to being treated as an invisible part of this city. But now, in the biting cold of winter, a man, a legend, stood before him. Not just speaking but acting immediately. Shaq wasted no time. He pulled out his phone, pressed it to his ear, and spoke in a deep, steady voice, firm, without a hint of hesitation. Book a hotel room. A flicker of surprise crossed the faces of the nearby bodyguards. But they knew all too well, once Shaq made a decision, nothing could stop him. Call a doctor. I want him checked out immediately. John's eyes widened, his hands clutching the tattered blanket draped over him. No one had ever cared about his health. No one had ever asked if he was okay. But Shaq had done so within minutes of meeting him. And get him a hot meal right now. I do not want him waiting. Shaq's bodyguards moved instantly, needing no further explanation. John blinked, his gaze flickering between hope and disbelief. Shaq's words seemed to come from another world, a world he had long ceased to belong to. A hotel room, a doctor, a hot meal. These were luxuries beyond reach for someone like him. Moments later, one of the bodyguards returned, carrying a paper bag from a nearby restaurant. The rich aroma of hot soup, fresh bread, and a hearty stew filled the air, immediately awakening a hunger so deep within John that it almost hurt. A hunger he had trained himself to ignore for far too long. The bodyguard extended the bowl of soup toward John, but he did not take it right away. He hesitated. Shaq sat down right next to him, completely unfazed by the grimy sidewalk or the curious stares from passers-by. He gently pushed the bowl closer, his voice not just an offer, but a reassurance. Eat, you need your strength to start again. John stared at the bowl, then up at Shaq, his eyes glistening not from the cold. Slowly he reached out, his fingers trembling from hunger, from exhaustion, from the disbelief that he was actually allowed to have a proper meal. As his fingertips touched the warm bowl, he felt its comforting heat seep into his skin, a sensation he had not felt in what seemed like forever. He lifted the bowl slightly, stirring the soup with the spoon, as if testing whether this was real or just another cruel dream. But as the rich aroma rose, the steam curling into the frozen night air, and as he took his first sip, tears fell. John could not hold them back anymore. He had learned to live with hunger, but he had never learned to live with kindness. Shaq remained beside him, saying nothing, just quietly watching the man before him. He understood. He did not rush him. He simply stayed. John continued eating spoonful by spoonful, as if afraid that if he ate too quickly, it would all vanish in an instant. But Shaq did not leave. He did not just toss John a meal and walk away. Like so many others, he stayed, because he knew that sometimes what a person needs is not just food, but the presence of someone who reminds them they are not alone. John sat quietly in the sleek black SUV, his gaze drifting over the luxurious interior, the soft leather seats, the faint, sophisticated scent lingering in the air, the comforting warmth from the heating system. Everything felt foreign to him. Just an hour ago, he had been sitting on a sidewalk, cold, exhausted and hopeless. And now he was being driven to a luxury hotel. John clenched his hands together, feeling the rough, calloused texture of his own skin. The hands of a man too familiar with the biting cold, with hardship, with a life spent drifting without a place to call home. He glanced to the side. Shaq sat there, relaxed, composed, as if bringing a homeless man to an upscale hotel was the most ordinary thing in the world. But to John this was anything but normal. As the car slowed to a stop in front of the hotel, a wave of unease washed over him. He did not belong here. He was used to the disdainful looks from security guards, the wary glances of the wealthy, as they passed him on the street, as if his mere presence tainted their world. But this time no one dared to stop him, because he stepped out of the car, alongside Shaquille O'Neal. Walking into the hotel lobby, John felt an overwhelming sense of discomfort, an almost surreal detachment. The plush red carpets beneath his feet, the dazzling chandeliers above, the elegantly dressed guests passing by. It was a world he had never imagined stepping into. The front desk staff did not ask any questions. They simply handed the room key to Shaq's security team, as if they understood that this man, despite the tattered clothes he wore, was just as important as any other guest in the building. John was led upstairs. The door opened, revealing a spacious, warm, immaculate room. He did not step inside immediately. He hesitated at the threshold. Did he truly deserve this? Shaq seemed to understand his thoughts. He did not say anything, just gave John a reassuring pat on the back. John took a deep breath and stepped forward. For the first time in years, he had a place to stay. He stood before the mirror, staring at himself, his gaunt face, his skin, darkened from years of exposure to the harsh elements, his unkempt hair, clumped together from the lack of clean water. He barely recognized himself. A strange emotion stirred within him. Not fear, not despair. Hope. He stepped into the bathroom. As the hot water cascaded down his back, warmth spread through his body, and he could not suppress a quiet sigh of relief. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt warm. He took his time in the shower, not because he needed to scrub away the grime, but because he was washing away a part of his past. After he finished, he noticed a neatly folded set of clean clothes. On the bed, no more tattered fabric clinging to his skin. No more stench of days spent wandering the streets. He put them on, then he turned to the bed. A real bed. John sat down, running his fingers over the soft, inviting comforter. As if touching something both foreign and miraculous, he lay back for the first time in years. He was not on cold concrete, not under a makeshift shelter, not gripped by the fear of being attacked or chased away. He closed his eyes, and in that moment, for the first time in a long while, he felt safe. Shaq stood at the doorway, watching as John drifted into sleep. He smiled slightly. The first step is done. But he knew John's story was not over. This was just the beginning. The morning sunlight filtered through the hotel room's curtains, casting a warm glow over the pristine white sheets. A rare touch of warmth in the midst of a cold winter. John woke up not because of blaring car horns or the rhythmic stumping of feet on the sidewalk, but because of something he had not felt in a long time. Peace. He stared at the ceiling for a few seconds, letting the realization sink in. He was no longer on the streets. No more endless gray sky looming over him. No more biting wind, cutting through the gaps in his tattered clothing. No more waking up shivering from the cold. Every morning, I'm still alive, the thought flashed through his mind, like a bolt of lightning. But this time it was not accompanied by despair or fear. It carried something else. Something he had not dared to believe in for a long time. Hope. John sat up, his bare feet sinking into the soft carpet beneath the bed. The sensation made him pause. When was the last time he had touched something this soft? Maybe before everything fell apart. Slowly he stepped out of the room, where a breakfast table had already been set, and there waiting for him was Shaq. Shaq looked up as John approached, studying the man before him. He did not say anything right away, just observed John looked different from last night. No more filthy tattered clothes. No more layers of dirt caked onto his skin. He was still thin, still worn, but he was clean, he was alert. And in his eyes there was something, a small but undeniable flicker of light. Hope had never been an easy thing to hold on to, but once a person found it, they would never be the same again. Shaq smiled and gestured for John to sit. They ate in silence, but it was not the awkward kind. It was the silence of a new beginning. As John was finishing his meal, Shaq set his coffee cup down, gently locking eyes with him. His voice was calm, steady, but filled with certainty. I found an organization. Veterans United, they'll help you get housing, a job, and a fresh start. John froze, the spoon in his hand hovering midair. He looked at Shaq, his eyes wide with disbelief. Really? His voice trembled not from fear, but from uncertainty. He could not let himself believe this was real. Do I really have a chance to start over? Shaq did not smile. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply met John's gaze with unwavering certainty and nodded. You fought for this country. Now it's time for this country to fight for you. John swallowed hard and looked down at his hands, hands that had once held weapons, to protect people he had never even met. He had been ready to die for this country. Yet when he came back, no one remembered him. But now someone had. Someone had seen him, and someone had given him a chance. John clenched his hands into fists and took a deep breath. There was still a long road ahead. Still so much work to be done. But for the first time in years, he did not feel trapped in the darkness anymore, because someone had lit a flame, and he would not let it go out. John sat on the leather chair in the small hotel conference room, his hands gripping his knees tightly. A restless energy surged in his chest, making it impossible to sit still. His life had been riddled with betrayal, with empty promises. Would this time be any different? Shaq sat beside him silent, but his gaze held a steady certainty that could push back any doubt. The door swung open and two men walked in. One middle-aged with graying hair, a stern yet kind face, dressed in a simple suit. The other younger, with the sharp eyes of someone accustomed to changing the fate of those society had left behind. They were representatives of Veterans United. John instinctively straightened, feeling as though he were once again a young soldier standing before a commanding officer. The older man offered a warm smile and extended his hand. Welcome, John. We've heard a lot about you from Shaq, and I want you to know starting today, you're not alone anymore. John swallowed hard. Not alone anymore. Those words echoed in his mind, as if a part of him did not dare believe he could hear them again. They sat down, and the younger man opened a folder in front of John. Veterans United is an organization dedicated to helping veterans like you, those who fought but came back with nothing. We do not just provide housing, we help you find yourself again. John listened in silence as the man continued. We have a housing assistance program specifically for veterans. We'll help you secure a stable home, a place you can call your own, where you'll never have to worry about being kicked out or sleeping on the streets again. Stable housing. John shivered slightly at the thought. Having a door to lock a bed where he could sleep without fearing being jolted awake in the middle of the night. It was something he had long given up hope for. But the man was not done yet. We also offer job training. Programs will help you learn a new skill, a career that will allow you to stand on your own 2 feet again. John clenched his fists. A job. A real chance to be part of society, instead of just a shadow drifting through the streets. And finally the man said, his voice dropping into something more profound, more heartfelt, we offer mental health support. We know that the battle does not end when you leave the battlefield. It continues in your mind every single day. We have doctors, fellow veterans, people who truly understand what you're going through, and they'll help you get through it. Those words hit John like a tidal wave. Someone understands, someone actually cares. Shaq sat quietly watching John, reading the war waging inside him. Through the flickers in his expression, this was not just a plan, this was a road to a new life. And then Shaq did something John never expected. He pulled out a check from his jacket pocket, placed it on the table, and slid it toward the Veterans United representatives. John's eyes widened, stunned as he caught the number written on it. Shaq spoke in his usual calm, steady tone, as if he had simply placed a cup of coffee on the table. I'll cover his first year. The room fell into silence. John stared at Shaq, trying to decipher whether this was some kind of joke. But Shaq was not joking. He was simply the kind of man who did the right thing, without seeking recognition or praise. John pressed his lips together, something thick and heavy tightening in his throat. He had lost everything, but someone had stepped up for him. His hands trembled slightly as he fought to keep himself together. But his vision blurred for the first time in years. His tears fell not from pain, but from something else entirely. He looked up at Shaq, his voice breaking raw with emotion. This is a miracle. Shaq did not smile, did not offer any grand words. He simply placed a large, steady hand on John's shoulder, gripping it firmly, a silent reassurance. It's not a miracle, John. It's just what you've always deserved. And in that moment, John knew his life had truly changed. John still sat there on the chair, in the small conference room of the hotel. But inside him, everything had changed. He was no longer a homeless man, clinging to the freezing sidewalks of New York. No longer an invisible ghost society passed by without a second glance. For the first time in many years, he felt like a person of value. A person with a future. Shaq slowly stood up, ready to leave. He had done what he came to do. He was not the kind of man who lingered for gratitude, for recognition or praise. He was simply a man of action, a man who saw wrong and said it right. John looked up at the towering man before him, his eyes still glistening with moisture. But now it was more than just emotion. It was something else, something steady, something resolute. Shaq placed his large hand on John's shoulder, squeezing lightly. It was not just a gesture of encouragement. It was an affirmation, a message. One day you'll have a chance to help someone else. John hesitated for a brief moment, as if those words had awakened something inside him, something he had not yet realized himself. Help someone else. For years all he had thought about was survival. How to get his next meal. How to avoid the bone-chilling wind. How to keep from being chased away. How to make it through another day. But now Shaq had helped him stand. And if one day he could help someone else stand too. John took a deep breath, his hands, once accustomed to the cold, now beginning to feel the warmth of a new future. He no longer trembled, he no longer doubted. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he could take control of his own destiny. And he smiled, not a forced smile, not a bitter or hollow one, like he had worn for so many years. This was a smile of determination. He extended his hand this time, without hesitation, without fear. The hand of a man who had found himself again. Shaq took the handshake, saying nothing more. But John did. He met Shaq's eyes. His voice steady, firm, like the way he had once sworn an oath when he joined the military years ago. I promise I will pay it forward. Shaq gave a small nod, as if he had always known John would say that, because a man like John, a man who had once been willing to fight, to sacrifice for those he had never even met, would never forget what had been given to him. He would never let this be just a gift. He would turn it into a promise. And a soldier, no matter how far from the battlefield, always keeps his word. Shaq slowly stepped out of the hotel, leaving behind a John Miller, who was no longer the homeless man he had been yesterday. He was no longer a forgotten drifter lost in the crowd, no longer a veteran abandoned by his country. He was a man who had found himself again. Outside the air was still cold, but the wind seemed to have softened. Or perhaps it was the human heart that had changed. A reporter stood nearby, camera in hand, ready to capture the moment. As soon as Shaq walked out, the story had gained attention. A basketball legend, stopping in the middle of the street to help a homeless man, a small act, but one carrying the power of transformation. Shaq did not shy away. He knew this was not just about him anymore. It was bigger than that. Looking straight into the camera, his eyes were deep yet resolute. A small gesture can change a life. He paused, letting the words sink in. You did not need to be a millionaire. You did not need to be a legend. You just needed to be someone who cared. Do not turn your back on those who need help. Around him the crowd fell silent. A simple statement, yet it carried an undeniable power. The power of kindness, the power of change. This story was no longer just about Shaq or John. It was about all of us, a small but warm apartment. John stood in front of the mirror, adjusting a neatly pressed shirt. For the first time in years, he was not wrapped in a torn coat or an old, tattered blanket. The face staring back at him was no longer one of desperation, but of a man ready to step into a new life. A job application sat on the table. John picked it up, taking a deep breath. A week ago, he would not have dared to dream of having a roof over his head, let alone preparing for a job. But now he was doing it. A small photograph lay beside the application, a picture of a group of veterans. John gently ran his fingers over the image. The brothers he had lost, the men who had fought beside him, the ones he once thought he would follow. But he was still here, and he would live not just for himself, but for them. John smiled, not the forced smile of someone hiding pain, not the half-hearted grin of a man used to empty promises, but a real smile. The smile of a man who had been given a second chance. John had made a promise that one day he would help someone else, just as Shaq had helped him, and someday, somewhere on another street, he too would stop, he too would reach out his hand, and the circle of kindness would continue to grow. John Miller's story is not just his own. It represents thousands of homeless veterans out there, men and women, who once gave their youth to serve and protect, only to be forgotten when they needed help the most. But sometimes all it takes is one small act, one extended hand at the right moment to change a life. Shaquille O'Neal showed the world that kindness does not have to be grand. It does not have to come with conditions. It just has to come from the heart. Do you believe that one small action can make a big difference? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched you, hit like, share it to spread the message. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories. Let's make the world a better place together.